Policy Drivers, the video podcast where we have a chance to talk to leaders in planning and policy who are helping make Texas a better place to live. Today, we're talking with Heyden Black Walker. She's an Austinite currently working as the Director of Planning at Black & Vernooy Architecture and Urban Design. She has her Master's of Science in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Texas at Austin, a CNUA certification from the Congress for New Urbanism, and was a 2016 Fellow of the National Walk College. While Heyden's day job is in urban planning and consulting, she never misses a moment to advocate for her community. She strongly supports Reconnect Austin, Bike Austin, and Walk Austin, serves on the Pedestrian Advisory Council, and is a board member of Vision Zero ATX. Heyden's ambition and desire to be involved with help implement real positive change where transportation and pedestrians intersect here in Austin. So welcome, Heyden, to our episode of Policy Drivers. I now want to give you the chance to introduce yourself and get anything that maybe I missed.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. There's some other boards I serve on, but I think all of them are really important. I guess I'll mention a couple more just because they really tie into this whole idea of advocacy and policy. One is the Congress for New Urbanism. Central Texas has one of the most active chapters in the country that was formed in, I think, 2008. And so that's, I feel like CNU, Central Texas, has been really effective in influencing policy and bringing in thought leaders and trying to shape the dialogue. And then the other one is relatively new, but I think is also important, which is Austin Outside. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that's really a coalition of primarily nonprofits, but also some businesses advocating for the outdoor environment. And so a lot of the member organizations are open space groups, people like the Austin Parks Foundation and the Hill Country Conservancy and the Shoal Creek Conservancy, Waterloo Greenway. But then that's mixed with active transportation because there's this very strong recognition that people should be able to walk to and to use those facilities. But then those facilities, especially like Waterloo Greenway that will connect the University of Texas to Town Lake, are also transportation facilities for people walking and biking. So that's been really helpful because bringing all those groups together to share information and be in the same space is a really powerful advocacy tool. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing on those. Those are all very important things that hopefully our listeners are very excited to get involved with as well.
Yeah.
So as we kind of referenced earlier, you are currently an advocate in the local transportation and urban planning space in Austin, and you obviously previously studied community and regional planning. So when you were a student yourself, did you always expect that you would begin to get locally involved in your city's transportation space? Did that evolve kind of later in your studies? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I wasn't really that focused on transportation when I was in grad school. I grew up in Austin. I grew up around my father, who is a very prominent local advocate. So I probably was always destined to, end up in the advocacy world. When I got out of college, I moved to San Diego for several years and I worked for a planning firm there. And out of that, I did a number of different things in the planning world at that company, and really decided that I liked the long range, kind of more policy directed planning better. And then my husband and I decided we saved our money for a long time, decided to quit our jobs, travel around the world, which was great for learning about all sorts of things, including other ways to get around. And came back, went to graduate school, decided that having children in the middle of graduate school was a really good idea. That's a whole nother subject. But, excuse me. And then ended up actually teaching for 10 years when my kids were little. And when I decided to go back to planning, I talked my father into a job. And I think that I'd always been really interested in transportation, but I'd only sort of, I think, partially recognized how important it is to our built environment and how much it affects everything we do. I did write one paper in graduate school just out of interest. I took a transportation planning class from Susan Handy when she used to be teaching in the CRP program. And I wrote a paper for her and just interviewed people I knew, including a cousin who had 4 children, about how they get around during the day. And I was horrified by what I found out. Like, my cousin with 4 children literally drove like 600 miles a week because they lived in a neighborhood that wasn't very safe. And so they wanted their kids to go to school in a safer neighborhood, which meant they had to have a babysitter in that neighborhood, which meant all their kids' friends were in that neighborhood, and the Girl Scout troops and the, baseball teams and everything. And then my cousin and her husband worked full time. And it was really an eye-opener for me. I think that was the start of my interest in transportation. It's like, really, we're going to lock people into their cars? Like, what kind of life is that? So anyway, and then when I finished teaching, I came back to work for the firm and with my dad. And like I said, he has a long history of advocacy, especially around urban design in Austin. And so it was kind of natural for his firm that I work for. We donate a lot of our time to advocacy, which allows me to do a lot of it, which is I'm really lucky that I get to do that.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I always love hearing about how people get into the space they are now and kind of hearing that journey. And it's so interesting how you got to travel around a bit. And I'm sure that influenced a lot of the things you're probably doing today. I always find it really fascinating seeing how other countries handle similar situations in completely different ways.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I also think the comment about large families hit a little close to home for me. I'm the oldest of 4 children, and there were a couple, and we live way out of the town where I grew up. And so there were a couple days where everyone ended up driving separately just to get everybody where they needed to be on time, which is not ideal.
No, it's not. It takes a lot of investment in cars and car infrastructure for that to work.
Yes, it absolutely does. So hearing a little bit about kind of your story, just kind of scratching the surface and kind of how you got to where you were and where you are now, what do you wish someone would have kind of told you when you were getting into this space, and what kind of skills have you acquired, or current skills that you had that maybe needed some tweaking?
That's a hard one. I don't know what I wish someone had told me. I mean, I guess I'd watched my dad do it for a long time, so I wasn't too surprised by some of the aspects of it. I sometimes wish, I think after I finished in the CRP program, they started allowing people to do a Master's of Public Policy and CRP together. That wasn't an option when I was in school, and if it had been, I think that would have been really helpful, because I don't think I recognized until I started doing it how important policy is. I mean, it makes sense, but just kind of being in that space and realizing that you have to figure out how to get the right policy in place often, so you can kind of use that policy as a hammer to say, look, you set this policy direction and you're not following it. What are we going to change so that you can follow it? And making those changes, especially really specific rules and kind of technical things that happen sort of in the background that really affect our transportation system. You have to have an overarching kind of vision of something better to be able to change those specific rules that are very entrenched. And that can be hard, and it can take a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really great knowledge to know and to have. Hopefully we can all take some of that too in the future going forward.
Yeah, don't let that stop you. It's really rewarding. And one of the things I find is fascinating is sometimes the changes just happen by surprise. You don't know who talked to somebody else at a cocktail party, or the right person at the right time. Sometimes you can track that, and sometimes and sometimes these things just come out of the blue, and you're like, oh my God, I've been saying this for 10 years, and somebody all of a sudden just did it, and so you just got to keep pressing ahead and celebrate the wins when you get the wins.
Absolutely. That is, yes, I totally agree with you there. So as Director of Planning at Black and Vernooy Architecture and Urban Design, can you tell us a little bit more about Great Streets and how Austin maybe has been adding this initiative in, and what the best next steps are that the city can take?
Absolutely. I have a lot of opinions about Great Streets.
Awesome.
So our firm, we had a joint venture with George Kinney, who's a local architect. And then we had a really amazing design team. And I say we, I wasn't with the firm at that point, but, my dad was there. Ellie McKinney and Donna Carter and a bunch of other people. The joint venture was the prime on the project, and then we had all these subcontractors. And we wrote the Great Streets Master Plan for all of downtown. And Second Street is the first implementation, and a lot of people at the time, we had a lot of help from the Downtown Austin Alliance in terms of kind of political support, because a lot of people, I think this is true for a lot of people, if you're not in this field or you're not used to thinking about the built environment, you may not really realize how, somebody constructed it that way, and it can be reconstructed in a different way, and reconstructing it will change the use, right? But it's really hard for people to envision. And we got a lot of resistance on Great Streets, and it kind of barely passed council at the time. Many people, according to Sinclair, have come up to him in the years afterwards and said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I didn't support it at the time. Second Street is lovely. All of our streets should look like that. Why don't we do more of it? Right? But it takes kind of that Lone Ranger sometimes to say, this is really important. And Second Street has been wildly successful. It used to be surface parking lots and like 1960s warehouses that were, just awful. In fact, at one point we created a slide we use in presentations that's a picture of Second Street from the 1980s, which I'm old. To me, that doesn't sound that long ago. And Second Street now. And it literally took me like 3 months to find a picture because it was such a horrible place. Nobody took pictures of it, right? There are pictures of it all over the place now. But it was very, very hard to find an old picture of it. Second Street is a really great example of what our downtown streets could be. There have been some implementations that are less than great streets. I would say Brazos has some problems. The Great Streets Master Plan was adopted in 2000. It's been 20 years. We really could have implemented all of downtown streets as great streets, but we haven't done it. And one of the first things we should be doing that is a very, unfortunately, politically charged issue, which I don't necessarily agree with it being politically charged because I believe it's the right thing to do, is to switch all, or maybe we leave Guadalupe and Lavaca and 5th and 6th alone because of the one-way pairings. But outside of those streets, every street in downtown should be two-way. And there's a great, and that's one of the things the Great Streets Master Plan calls for. Even if we can't afford to rebuild them with wider sidewalks and make them, and put in street trees and everything else we should be doing, which I would argue we can't afford to do. And we did on Second Street, and the property, the increase in the return on investment, the increase in value is significant. And we should recognize that, and we should do it more. But even if it's going to take us longer to do that, we should move all of those streets back to two-way streets. They're slower, they're safer, they're better for people walking. The city has tried. They get a lot of resistance from property owners who think that it might damage the way that cars go in and out of their garages. And I think they should do it anyway. But that's my opinion. I don't have to stand there and get yelled at. So I would hope that we would have a renewed interest in implementing great streets, but there's not really a champion within the city, and that makes it hard. And even recent sidewalks that have been built downtown, those sidewalks were needed. It was really important for them to be put in for ADA, but they were put in by the Public Works Department. They did not even seem to know what great streets were, and they weren't built to great street standards at all. And that was 6 months ago. So I don't know. It may be something that I have to take on again and raise a little cane and see if I can improve the situation.
Oh, we believe in you. I'm sure that you could really implement some change there. But it's interesting though when you talk about Second Street, because I grew up here in Austin, and it really is just so fascinating seeing how much the downtown space has changed and shifted. I mean, not to a very large extent, but if you just look at the traffic flow, and especially on Second Street, like I remember when I was learning to drive, and the first couple of times when I had learned to drive down there, my mom was just like, okay, like just look out for everything, drive crazy, and all these things. It just really frustrating, and don't park there, and and there was just a tons of stuff that, I mean, downtown is still kind of like that, but it's gotten better, and it's been nice seeing not only like some changes that are kind of not necessarily what I would have wanted, but looking at the changes that have really made Austin a better, I guess, like livable space. So it's cool that you bring that up, because it's been something that I've definitely noticed coming back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays there's a 32-foot wide sidewalk on the north side and 18 feet on the south side, and there's a double row of trees on that north side, and there's outdoor cafes, and it's hard to imagine that it was 4 lanes of fairly high speed one-way traffic to get people to Mopac as fast as they could go. And one-way traffic like that, there's a lot of jockeying, a lot of speeding. It's a horrible environment for a human being. So it's a great testament to the way you can change a street, and people still drive it. You can still get through. It just doesn't have to be a raceway.
Great testament. Hopefully they'll emulate that and move it further towards all the other streets.
I hope so.
So you've touched a lot on how you kind of are able to use your work at the firm and your interest in the transportation and urban planning space. So aside from some things you've already mentioned, what are some really big tensions that you've kind of come across? Like, do they tend to complement each other fairly well where you work now and your interest in transportation and urban planning, or do they sometimes kind of clash to a point where it's difficult to move forward?
You mean like personally or within the firm?
Personally.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people like interested in a lot of different things. And I guess one of the things that I find a lot of tension with is I manage a nonprofit and an initiative called Reconnect Austin, which is a better vision for I-35 than what TxDOT's proposing. And I've been doing that for 8 years. And, it's a really, really important project, but sometimes I just hate it, It's so hard to get a Department of Transportation to listen to a different vision than what they want to put forward. I also recognize that, like, for example, I did a lot of work behind the scenes to get the 2016 bond in Austin passed, and that provided a lot of money for sidewalks, and now the city of Austin's building sidewalks in high priority neighborhoods, right? And they have a matrix that prioritizes sidewalks through a whole bunch of metrics that are really good. Like, they're looking at, is it close to a bus stop? Is it close to a park? Is it close to a school? Is it in a neighborhood that has a lower than average median income where more people are probably walking, right? Is it in a neighborhood where there might be facilities where there are more people who have different abilities and might be in wheelchairs? So there's a lot more to it than that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's so hard to get a good sidewalk master plan in place and then get funding to build the sidewalks and then put the sidewalks out there. And those sidewalks make such a huge difference to people. Sometimes it feels like, I just want to focus on that, right? That makes a difference in people's everyday lives. I remember when I was a young mother and pushing a stroller on a street with no sidewalk and wishing there was a safe place to walk and a safe way to cross the street, right? So while I think I-35 is really important, I have this kind of tension within myself. Like some days I just want to not have to think about that big, huge project and all of the politics and all of the angst that goes along with it, and just focus on getting a more walkable Austin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great goal that all of us here really, really hope happens.
Yeah.
So what would you say your like personal philosophy is about how to engage with maybe stakeholders that might not have similar backgrounds or viewpoints? You kind of touched lightly on how sometimes people push back if it's not something that's on their agenda or something they want. So what would your personal philosophy kind of be there?
I think it's really important to listen and listen well. I think it's important to reach out. And I think it's really important not to burn any bridges. You know, this space is not very big, and you run into the same people a lot. There's no reason to be so rude to someone that in the future when you meet them on a project, they're not going to even speak to you. And sometimes, you know, that's not always easy, but I don't know. I guess that's, you know, it's just kind of keep going and recognize that, you know, a lot of people have different opinions. Yeah, I guess there's a balance, right? I mean, like I spent a lot of time working on what we refer to as a Shoal Creek bike lane, although I would prefer we talked about it as making Shoal Creek better for everybody, right? In my opinion, a two-way bike lane on Shoal Creek, and I live 1 block away from it, has made it safer for bicyclists in the bike lane, a protected bike lane, but it's also made it much better for pedestrians. The city added missing sidewalks, they shortened street crossing distances, and I think most importantly, it slowed down the speed of vehicular travel on the street, right? People are now actually driving under 30 miles an hour instead of having a street sign that says 30 and everyone driving considerably faster than that. And so there's a balance. Like you've got to listen, but most of my neighbors who live on Shoal Creek hate that project. They hated it before it was built and they kind of still hate it, right? It's a public street. I think it serves the public better in the configuration that it's in. And I think as people get used to it, maybe they'll calm down a little bit. And there are a lot of people that love it. Not everybody hates it, but there's a balance. You know, you have, if that street had never, if that bike lane and all those other improvements had never gotten put in because we let a few, or maybe more than a few people who thought it was a bad idea get their way, then the rest of the people who use that street every day, and it's so crowded out there now, I don't even go use it because I have to wear a mask because I'm too close to people, right? So it's a classic, if you build it, they will come. But it's also that tension between what you kind of know is best practice and it's the right thing to do citywide versus what people are saying that were directly impacted by that project.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've whenever I drive sometimes down streets that are clearly they're neighborhoods, but they're also public streets. Mm-hmm. And so I mean, it happens where I live sometimes too. And, but I would personally rather have sidewalks on our public neighborhood street for walking. And yes, it would be slightly inconvenient, I guess, while they're doing the actual work there. But when you think about it, it's really better for everyone. And so in the neighborhood, if you're frustrated that they're wanting to put in sidewalks, it's like, well, you get something out of it too. Hopefully people will be driving slower and hopefully you'll be able to actually walk without the things you're typically complaining about is cars driving too fast because you don't have a sidewalk to be on protected. So I think it's just so interesting how all of it, like you're saying, is so connected.
Right. It's an interesting dynamic. And it's hard when people say, well, nobody walks there. Well, you don't, I mean, the classic saying is you don't build a bridge based on how many people try to swim the river, you know?
No, absolutely. It's like, of course, they're not walking there. Would you walk somewhere if you don't, feel safe? Probably.
Right. Not unless you have to.
Right. Exactly. Oh, that's really interesting. So I think another thing that's been really interesting in the policy space and kind of just in the world, in the modern world we see now, is this new age of generalists. And they talk with us a lot about it. I don't know about August, but at LBJ, they talk about a lot of times like policy generalists. However, I feel like, especially within this intern cohort and a lot of our classmates, we all have a bunch of like very specific interests that may or may not kind of organically intersect. And so since you have so many wonderful interests that you've been able to intersect throughout your career, what kind of recommendations would you give us and our listeners on how to bridge together various disciplines moving forward, not only in like the professional space, but in policy advocacy as well?
Yeah, I think it's a hard balance. I mean, we've built these really complicated systems, right? And people have to understand how to run these complicated systems and these vast pieces of infrastructure that take a lot of technical expertise. But I would call myself a generalist, and I value that a lot. Just, I think it's important to understand things from different perspectives and to be able to hear people talk about different perspectives. There's a hilarious little video that's very old that Chuck Marohn made years ago. It's an engineer talking to a homeowner, and it's kind of a classic, like he's so embedded in, it's a cartoon, but the engineer is so embedded in what he's trying to do that he thinks is right, that he can't hear the homeowner saying, that's my front yard that you're going to turn into a road, that's where my children play. So I think there's a real danger in such, we've built these kind of, cliche, people talk about it all the time, but these kind of siloed things, and you see that in large bureaucracies. It's one of the reasons it's really hard to get a large bureaucracy to change the way they do things, because, people just they're not talking to each other, and they don't kind of appreciate that other perspective. I mean, I've been at national conferences where I've introduced two different people who both worked at the city of Austin, right? It's so big that they don't even know each other, which seems ridiculous. But it's the way the world works. So I guess we kind of need both, but I think it's important to at least be able to appreciate other perspectives and hear where someone else is coming from, and understand, a DOT's Department of Transportation might have an engineer whose idea of safety is completely different than mine, coming from a Vision Zero perspective. That doesn't mean that engineer is necessarily wrong, but I would expect that engineer to understand my point of view, and I would expect myself to listen to what they had to say, because there are different ways of looking at what we term safety as a general pot. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's really great advice to come back to, and just remember, okay, actually, if you're talking, especially in transportation space, because there are so many, as I've been learning, so many different viewpoints I never even really thought about. Just understanding that, this group of people might actually think that this is the best idea, but I don't think this is the best idea. So how can we kind of come together and make the best idea together?
Right.
I think that's definitely really, really good advice.
Right. Well, and part of that is just speaking the language. Sometimes people will say to me, oh, you're so smart, about highways. I'm like, you drive highways all the time. The same thing I do. You just don't know the language that they use, And often in a bureaucracy or in a field, using super technical language is a way to exclude the rest of the population. And I think that that's wrong. And I think we ought to give people credit for being a lot smarter. And just because you don't know what a collector distributor lane is doesn't mean you haven't gotten on one to exit MOPAC, So I think that's kind of a bridge sometimes that advocates can play that's important between kind of the technical side and the public side, is helping people understand that just because something sounds really complicated, it often isn't, and we all understand it, and we can have a conversation about it.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very good. We all should listen more and recognize that we are all very smart. I think that's great to know. I want to pass it off to some of my other colleagues now. I don't want to take up all of your time, but I know they have some questions too, so I'll kind of yield the floor.
Okay.
Now.
I am glad that you mentioned the importance of shared vocabulary. I am a bit of a word nerd. So what are there organizations or individuals, either locally or nationally, that are sort of dedicated to that goal of establishing a shared vocabulary between planners or policymakers or advocates or just members of the general public to try and understand this very technical, complicated idea? Or is that maybe a need in the field to sort of define these complex terms in ways that is easily understandable for people?
I would say I think it's a need. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but I think it's important. There's a really brilliant engineer named Ian Lockwood who works for Tool Design, and Ian talks about the importance of words. He actually helped create the concept of a complete street, which is has made it into our vocabulary. We think about that a lot. And I got to talk to him about it once on a phone call. I called him on like Friday afternoon, and he spent like an hour and a half with me on the phone. He's a very dear man. And, one of the things he said was, you had this, before complete streets was invented as a term, you had this kind of engineering side where, there were all these technical things that a street was supposed to do and technical ways of defining exactly what a street or a road was. And then there was this kind of touchy-feely, but it should be walkable. Oh, it should be more comfortable. Oh, let's have more shade or whatever that, it was all kind of a little bit nebulous. And it's really hard to change the way people think about things if one thing feels kind of nebulous and undefined and one thing has this very technical defined aspect to it. And so they created the concept of a complete street, right? It may not be perfect. Sinclair's famous for saying, a great street is a complete street is not a great street, which I think is a really important point. But so Ian, to go back to the main part of the question, Ian talks about the way we talk about transportation and the bias in the words that we use. And I'm not sure off the top of my head I could come up with a great example, but you can Google some of his papers that he's written about it. And he does a great job of, noting that a term that we think about that is technical in the transportation side is actually highly biased and paints a picture in people's minds of streets being a certain thing, and that there are better words that we can use. They're not only clearer, but also less biased. So I think that he's one of the only people I've ever seen do that. And I think there's a really great space, maybe in other fields too, related to policy and planning, where that could be identified. The term that you use has these biases. Let's think about how we use a term that's clearer, but also isn't kind of shaping the outcome by the bias implied in the term.
Ian also does little comic strip style to illustrate things, and they're very fun, but it's also like a philosophy of like, you don't want to have urban planners or transportation people be this secret elite. Like instead you want to make these issues very explainable and make it sort of accessible to everyone to understand the concept. So it's sort of the political act that he does, the little funny drawings.
Yep. He told me on that phone call that he does this when he gets really frustrated. It's his therapy. But he does a really amazing job of identifying the hypocrisies in what we say in the transportation system and turning it into something funny, but that's really easy to understand. It's a great way to use humor.
Well, you also mentioned Vision Zero earlier, and since you're on the board, and that's also one of Farm&City's major initiatives right now. So I guess we're kind of wondering what sort of pulled you specifically into that space, and how do you think Austin and the whole state of Texas can continue to make progress towards ending traffic deaths and injuries?
Well, what pulled me into the space was I guess it was late 2014, maybe 2015. Because of my interest in walkability, I was kind of grasping around trying to find other people that were interested in walkability in maybe 2013. And the city had done a kind of a one-day workshop that was free when they brought in some experts, and I got to go to that, and it kind of put people that were interested in walkability in the same space. And what came out of that was the Pedestrian Advisory Council. Council member Chris Riley had already helped establish the Bicycle Advisory Council. And there were some people who were saying, well, the BAC is dealing with pedestrian issues too. We don't need a separate council. But I think that gathering helped kind of highlight the need for a pedestrian advisory council. And I guess the story is partially to say, it's really important to reach out to the people who are operating in your same space. Like Jay and I spend a lot of time working together on things. It's really important to have that kind of network because it evolves over time. So if I hadn't been on the Pedestrian Advisory Council, I wouldn't have met Nick Moe. And Nick was on the PAC, but he came at it from the public health side. And he'd heard about Vision Zero. When he first said it, I had no idea what he was talking about. Despite the fact that I'm supposed to be a transportation professional, I'd never heard of Vision Zero. And so we started talking about it, and I started learning, how many people die in traffic. And it's just, it was appalling to me. I mean, I think a lot of us just grow up, believing that, well, people die in traffic, but, it's kind of the cost of doing business, which is a horrible thing to say. I mean, really, do we really believe that? But like most of you, I grew up in Texas. I had friends that were either injured for life and ended up, in a wheelchair and then died early or died in traffic. And I never really thought completely about why that was happening. I didn't recognize that was very much a function of the way we design our streets. I didn't recognize that we had to talk about it in order to get that to change. And so in 2015, the PAC was already talking about Vision Zero quite a bit. And 2015 happened to be, unfortunately, the year that more people than ever, than in the entire history of the city of Austin, died in traffic that year, 102 people. And so we put together a hasty vigil to recognize that. We got a lot of political support, including from the mayor and multiple city council members, and the police chief showed up and really kicked off that conversation. And in some ways, it feels like I've been working on Vision Zero forever. But then I recognized that it's really only been 5 or 6 years, which is really fast to change policy. So we went from saying, wow, we should have a Vision Zero policy. Humans are going to make mistakes. It's not acceptable for people to die. When humans make those mistakes, they shouldn't die or be severely injured as a result. We went from kind of talking about that concept to then having the Vision Zero be put into the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan as a policy, which is really powerful. The transportation department just did that. It was one of those things where it just came out of the blue. I was like, excuse me, what's happening? And then, they wrote the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. And out of all the chapters in the Strategic Mobility Plan, safety is the first one. And the very first priority is that the transportation system should not hurt humans, basically. Vision Zero is so important, and it's so important the way we talk about it. Like, I knew how many people die in Texas every year, but it was Jay who first said, oh, it's 10 people a day, right? That's 10 people a day is really a more powerful way to talk about it than 3,600 people, right? And then I started meeting people who were directly impacted when their family members were in severe crashes. You know, I don't have any direct family members, but I have lots of friends and more distant relatives that have been impacted. And it's such a moral imperative, you know? It's like, why would we continue to build a transportation system that kills people? We know it kills people. We know how it kills people, and we know what we could do to make it different, right? And so why wouldn't we do something about it? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's really important, and I think it should be the lens through which we look at all of our transportation system all the time.
Yeah, I think that that's a very useful framework where it's like, if we see this problem and we know it's a problem, and especially if there are often some pretty relatively easy ways to start going about fixing it, why let it continue to be a problem? So I think that that is a great thing to bring up. It's like, there's no reason for people to keep dying if we can save them.
Right. And it goes back to the importance of having the right policy in place, right? We have a Vision Zero action plan. We have a pedestrian safety action plan. We have an Austin strategic mobility plan, you know, and when I talk to council members, I say, you know what, your budget is a moral document, and your budget has a lot of money for building road infrastructure for cars, but there's 30% of the population that don't drive. And if you don't drive, or you can't afford to own a car, you can't take advantage of that infrastructure that you're funding. And why aren't you funding? We don't fund sidewalks or bike lanes or urban trails in our budget. And why not? You know, what about that other 30% of the population? Why did they get nothing? So anyway, it all ties together. It's about how you prioritize your transportation system. And the important thing about the strategic mobility plan is that it sets a North Star. It sets the policy direction. And then you can go back to it and say, you have this adopted policy direction. Let's talk about what's not in place, or what's wrong about what is in place that is preventing that from happening.
Yeah, thank you. And I think August has our closing questions.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you have had a chance to use any of the Healthy Streets yet, but we had a question about your experience, if you have, and if you think that these streets are a temporary thing that could become a more permanent thing, how you think that we could learn from or borrow sort of the methods that they're using to divert through traffic and just have local traffic, to offer space for people to take up more space for playing and for recreation.
Right. Yeah, yes, I have used the Healthy Streets that are out there. We're expecting a new batch any day to go in. I'm actually kind of wondering if they're out there today, because the last time they put in a batch, it was on a Friday. So I'm hoping that they're out there doing it right now. Healthy Streets allow local traffic, but prioritize the humans in the environment, the bicyclists and the people walking, pushing a stroller, on a wheelchair. You know, I use walk, meaning anybody using any kind of assistive device to walk. You know, and when the resolution passed, Councilmember Tovo added some language at the very last minute that was powerful and wonderful. It was great that she thought about it. We hadn't really thought about it, which was evaluate these while they're on the ground and think about how they could become permanent. So, you know, I think one of the things about Healthy Streets, and a lot of cities are called slow streets, and many cities are experimenting with this in the time of COVID-19, where you need to give people space to exercise. You know, we have off and on closed down our parks and our trails, our swimming pools, because of overcrowding, and which makes it even more important that people have a safe space where they can go out and exercise. And one of the pushbacks I hear is, well, there was no community engagement, right? Which I would say, actually, I think they're a more powerful community engagement tool, because it's just a temporary change. It's barricades and barrels and signs, right? Those could be, you could pick those up in 10 minutes, right? There's nothing permanent yet about that. And, it's a classical tactical urbanism experiment, right? You can take it up if it's not working, you can iterate it, you can change, you can add to it, you can move things around and improve on what you've done. And I think the city has done a really good job of creating a very interactive website, and they're gathering a lot of input and a lot of data from people. I do recognize that not everyone has the ability to get online and get to that website, but they also created a Healthy Street Captain, kind of an ambassador network that's, they're training volunteers. I've been trained, but I haven't yet been assigned a Healthy Street, to go out and just make sure that the barricades and everything are in the right place and that things are going okay. But, those people can also talk to the public and get feedback in another way. So, kind of like I was saying about Second Street, it's a way that people can go out and see the street behaving in a different way and experience that. And then provide feedback on how that works for them, right? And I'll just say one of the other things that's come up that I think is really important is if you don't feel comfortable because of your race or your gender or your ability to move in the environment, or for whatever reason, if you don't feel comfortable being outside, it's not going to matter that much if the street is a healthy street or a regular street. And I think it's really important that we recognize that. We have a lot of work to do, but I would hope that a healthy street is a good step in the right direction, and it helps people see the amount of road space that we've given over to big, large, heavy machines that kill people, and that we can use our streets differently. And if it, I tell people all the time, like, look at what we've done with COVID-19, right? We've changed our entire lives. The 6 of us are sitting here on Zoom because of COVID-19, right? I sit in front of this computer all day long because of COVID-19. And I'm lucky I can work from home. The changes that people are experiencing are far worse than anything I've experienced. And it's important to recognize that this has been a horrible thing, but we have changed our whole lives because of this virus, right? So is it really horrible if I have to drive 15 or 20 miles an hour down a street and watch for more pedestrians and human beings on the street? I personally don't think it is. I think the street's a better place because of it, and I think we should be thinking about shared streets and making environments that serve everybody. But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think just as a side note to what you were saying, I think that seeing more humanity out and about is a good morale boost for people. Like, just even if you have to drive slower, I know that myself, when I drive down the street and there's like children playing, I'm immediately in a better mood. Like, like it reminds you of all of the good pieces of humanity that are sometimes get a little bit lost in our day-to-day lives when things are difficult or we're contemplating these big, heavy topics, right? So like being able to drive slower and like hear children laughing and see people riding their bikes, it's really nice, So I think that's it's a morale boost, it's a humanity boost, as well as a safety boost.
Yep, I would totally agree.
Wonderful. I think this has been such a really interesting time talking with you and being able to have this great discussion. And I know I've learned a lot of new things that are going to influence kind of the way that I not only look at transportation policy going forward, but as I finish my studies. And I just kind of want to give you the space to share anything else that any final words that you wanted to leave us with.
I don't know. We've covered so much ground.
You did awesome.
I'm not sure what else there is. I'm sure, we'll get off and we'll all think, oh, we should have talked about X, Y, or Z. But I guess the last thing, looking at Jay and thinking about all the work that we've done for speed management, and I think speed management is another one of those really, really, really important policies that gets us closer to Vision Zero. That when we first started asking about it, everybody kind of thought it couldn't be done, and we figured out a way that it could be done. And part of that is getting the right policy in place. Part of that is helping kind of bring the elected officials along on this journey with you. Like they understand, I think a lot of them understand transportation better than when they first took office. And part of that is once you get that policy in place, then you have to go back and look at those bad metrics and those bad rules that are lurking in the shadows. And part of this win on speed management was, stopping to use, that they stopped using the 85th percentile rule, which I've hated for years and I think is horrible, and I don't know who invented it. And using US limits too, right? And that change in the way that you measure and make decisions on a street made all the difference in the world. Right? But it takes people like you guys who understand the technical side behind it to get the right policy in place and then go kind of triage those technical pieces that are standing in the way and do something different. So I guess I'll leave you on that very nerdy note.
Well, that's great. We are policy nerds, so it's a great place to leave it on. So thank you so much for joining us today, Heyden. I know I speak for us all, and we really enjoyed talking with you. And all you policy drivers, we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.